Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is David Talbot, Managing Director and Head of Research at Red Cloud Securities. I'm delighted to host Red Cloud webinar on uranium today. We will hear from enCore Energy Management, including Paul Goranson, CEO, and Bill Sheriff, Executive Chairman. During today's webinar, they will provide an overview and outlook. Then we will take some questions. You can type the questions into the chat box at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. But before we kick things off, first we need to discuss the fine print. During this enCore Energy presentation, forward-looking statements may be made. I would direct listeners to their forward-looking statements outlined on page 2 of their presentation, and that can be found on the company website, encoreenergycorp.com. For Red Cloud Securities, Inc., I'd highlight this webinar is for information purposes only. It should not be considered a solicitation or recommendation to buy and sell securities. We note that this call does not consider the particular situation or needs of individual investors. Participants should rely on their own investigation, seek their own professional advice before investing. Please see our most recent research located on the Red Cloud website for specific disclosures on enCore Energy. But before Paul and Bill step up, I would like to say a couple words. First of all, a plug for our upcoming uranium conference. It's on Thursday, May 13th. We will have presentations from 18 different uranium companies, including enCore, plus a keynote address from Grant Isaac, CEO of Cameco, and I will host a fireside chat with 3 of the largest uranium investment firms, Sachem Cove, Segra, and L2. Attendees can register at redcloudfs.com for that conference. Just getting into it here, the nuclear industry, I believe, is in pretty good shape, and I think the outlook is even better. And we should see some trickle down into the uranium sector here, but really we've seen low prices get in the way. Now, that said, uranium demand does continue to rise. Government support is increasing, particularly in the US, China, and Russia. Uranium is getting recognition as a green energy source, and China is on track to become the largest nuclear power producer. Uranium supply has been falling. There have been significant mine curtailments, and COVID-19 impact was severe. But with a decade of low prices, we have not seen the investment necessary to sustain production levels, and those utilities that have been sitting on the sidelines will ultimately have to buy uranium to feed their power plants. I believe the nuclear industry is even stronger than it was pre-Fukushima. There's 443 reactors in operation. That's the same number as 10 years ago. Global uranium demand is 177 million pounds and growing between 2.5% and 3% per year. There are 53 reactors under construction. China plans to triple its nuclear capacity by 2030, and that will put China about 50% ahead of the US right now. India plans 21 new reactors by 2031. Japan is still targeting 20 to 22% nuclear power, and there are several countries entering the sector. United Arab Emirates, for example, just started 3 reactors recently, and they've got 4 more planned. And you've got several more countries coming down the road. Russia, for example, does a great job as being a one-stop shop for many countries going nuclear. It helps these countries with their regulations, funding, construction, even provides the fuel and the waste handling. And about 1/3 of all nuclear reactors in the world are being built by Russia. The US is building a couple of new reactors, and they still maintain 20% of its electricity from nuclear power. What has changed in the world is that the world is now focusing on lower greenhouse gas emissions. And there's only 2 ways to do that with baseload power: hydro and nuclear. If you look at Biden's recent White House fact sheet on his $2 trillion infrastructure plan, he made it clear that American hydro and nuclear need to be leveraged. And this could include use of small modular reactors or advanced reactors. Uranium production has declined to about 123 million pounds last year. And that leaves about a 55 million pound gap between supply and demand. I think McArthur River was a shock to the system when it closed because people saw that as a large mine, presumed it was low cost. But when that was the announcement on that, essentially uranium prices dropped $2 per pound that day. And that's really the 10th time that uranium prices have moved such an amount over the past 15 years. We have seen major operations come offline: McArthur, Rabbit, in Cameco, Cameco's operations in Canada, Cominac in Niger, Ranger in Australia. In Kazakhstan, we've seen Akdala and Zreknoy close as well. Almost everything in the U.S. is also offline. So, uranium production dominated by just a few mines. The top 10 mines produced 55% of all uranium in 2019. And that's even scarier when you start considering jurisdiction. Uranium is produced only in 14 countries, and 7 of those countries produce 94% of all uranium. Kazakhstan, Canada, Australia, Namibia, Uzbekistan, Niger, and Russia are the main producers. So bottom line here, with disinvestment in the uranium sector, there has been a lack of exploration and discoveries, and new mines will be needed in coming years to replace old mine closures, let alone cover the growth and demand. So that's a good segue on how enCore Energy can help solve this problem. And with that, I now turn it over to Paul and Bill to update the audience on your company. Gentlemen.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate that. It was a very good introduction and really sets the backdrop of about what enCore Energy is all about and why we've decided to come forth at the time we have. Just as a little bit of background, enCore Energy has really got quite a long history, although perhaps new to the investment community or with our reemergence. But it actually came out of Energy Metals, and which was a successful enterprise between 2005 and 2008, at which time I sold to Uranium One. I'd been on the board there and went with Uranium One for a couple of years, and then they started winding down or pulling back a bit, and saw the opportunity to go out and start again in the U.S. with an in situ focused enterprise in the U.S. And that's what enCore is. Our timing wasn't particularly good originally, as Fukushima came around right away, and we took the step of calling off, sending a letter to our investors saying game's over for 5 to 10 years. Wasn't a popular letter, but proved to be a good move for us as we went into essentially a hibernation stage. And only upon evaluating these trends that David cited, decided to really get aggressive, and that was going on about 10 months ago, maybe 11 months ago. And with that, we started looking around for how to jumpstart our ability to be a processor, a producer. There are 11 in situ plants that are licensed in the United States. We were able to acquire 2 of those in Texas. That radically moves us much quicker along in our development plans. You're probably looking at somewhere along the lines of 5 years to permit, do all the legwork, and actually build and construct in situ plants. Might be able to do it a little quicker in certain jurisdictions like Texas, but nonetheless, it really is a huge step for us. One of those plants is very quickly a timeline to getting it renovated and back in operational status, and I'll cover that a bit later, or Paul will. At the same time we were doing Energy Metals, Paul, our CEO, was running Alta Mesa, which is one of the few producers at the time that was actually selling into the spot market when it went from relatively modest levels, lower than they are now, to well over $100 a pound, and built that from the ground up, and was able to capitalize on that. So we were able to keep a good number of our team members, most of the technical team at Energy Metals, and as the basis of the enCore team. And we're so glad to get Paul to join us as CEO just within the past couple of quarters. As we really re-embark on this going forward. Our whole thesis is based on 3 strategies: short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Our short-term is clearly Texas, where we do have the licensed plants. We're in the initial stages of starting renovations on the Rosita plant. It should take less than a year and less than $1 million to get it operational. We will need to put in, that does not include the well fields, et cetera, and Paul will go into detail on that. The second plant is behind that, but Rosita will be the first one. And both of these plants were renovated back during the last boom. So not a great deal of work to do to bring those online. For our long term, we have extensive holdings in New Mexico, which was the U.S.'s biggest uranium resource and most prolific producer. There are some issues there, and I'll go into those as well. But that really is a 4 or 5 years down the road for us. And we're looking to some of the assets in Wyoming and elsewhere to fill in that midterm gap as we grow the Texas assets and move towards New Mexico. But essentially, the whole premise here is we're looking at what we think will be a decade-long or perhaps even longer time frame for a very healthy nuclear industry, which will be the first time that's happened since the Cold War. And we think we're very well positioned to take advantage of that in the United States, and with such a elite team of in situ experts. Excuse me. A little bit about the company. We have a $240 million market cap at the moment, as you can see. And one thing that we're pretty well evenly split between retail holders, primarily large individual retail, although there's certainly a spectrum of those, and institutional. Management holds about 10%, and we're well financed to get through the year in terms of our plans of bringing up certain resources to 43101, renovating plants, et cetera. I'd also point out that we were recent purchasers of 300,000 pounds of uranium concentrate, which we view primarily with the, in addition to it being underpriced, we really view that as a good security blanket when we enter into contracts as we bring our Texas production online, in that it will give us that certainty should we see any hiccups in our delivery schedule, we can rely on that inventory. And as I say, I think it'll grow with the prices as well. Our key strength here, in addition to the plants that are licensed and the rather large resource base, are our people. It's really the strength. Uranium is the 8th most common element on Earth. So really your technical expertise, especially given the long periods that we've had since the Cold War with very few uranium rallies in it. So to keep the team together is really quite special. And as I mentioned, Paul, leading the charge after having been with a number of companies and probably either designed, built, or worked on every in situ plant in the U.S., or certainly most of them, and a number of them worldwide as well. Incredible expertise to drive us forward. And Dr. Stover, our former CEO, is now our Chief Technical Officer. He's still quite vibrant and an expert in situ, and one of the co-founders of the process with a number of patents in the in situ field. Richard Cherry also brings years of experience with General Atomics to us. Mark Paliza spent most of his career with Uranium Resources, who is the previous company or the predecessor company to the operations we took over in Texas and many of the New Mexico assets as well. Bill Harris, our audit chair, rounds out the group with Nate Tewalt, who was formerly the CEO of Standard Uranium a decade ago or so. In addition, we have a qualified group of geologists on site, led by John Seeley, our manager of Texas Geology and Exploration, and Doug Underhill, our chief geologist, who spent 40-some years, a good number of that with the International Atomic Energy Association. A lot of these folks were with us in our previous endeavor, including Joe Harrington and Gordon Peak. Gene Spearing comes along as well, and of course, Carrie Merkey, our Chief Financial Officer. So we've got a very sound team, and we're well positioned to execute our plan. Once again, just as a brief overview, we've got the 2 licensed facilities in Texas with a 1.6 million pound per year capacity. I would point out there are no licensing restrictions in terms of expanding this capacity as well. It's a function of the equipment, and Paul can go into that a bit more as well. I touched on New Mexico. We've got the roughly 50% of the district under our control, certainly the dominant position in the industry, over 300,000 acres or 468 square miles of patented mineral rights that cost us not a dollar to maintain. These include about 32 million pounds of 43101 and almost 90 million pounds of historic mineral resources. Some of those are under a current study for upgrading to current standards at Juan Tafoya Marquez. We look forward to those results coming out here in the near future. It's key to mention the historical resources, and this doesn't just apply to ours, but to many of the others in the industry in the U.S. These historical resources were drilled out by major leading oil companies primarily during the 70s. And they have a very, very high percentage confirmation in terms of upgrading those to 43101. Thousands of drill holes were done by name brand, well-respected companies, and so they are of a significantly more important than most historical resources would be in other parts of the mining industry. Just touching on the other assets, we do have exploration assets in Wyoming, as well as Utah and Arizona. And we also have a 40% interest in Group 11, a private company that's doing research and development on in situ recovery methods using non-toxic solutions on a variety of metals, including uranium from sources that are thought to be non-leachable. Here again, speculative, but could be very important going forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Goranson, our CEO, and he'll take you through the more technical aspects. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I'll go ahead and get started here, and I'm going to be a little bit more granular in my discussion on our Texas assets, but also our other properties as well. We'll start off with, as Bill mentioned, our short-term strategy is to get into production, or at least be production capable when the market shows up. And so with this most recent transaction, we acquired 2 licensed in situ recovery facilities. We've got Rosita, which is the facility that's had the most recent update, and then Kingsville Dome, which has been a historic producer as well. Interestingly enough is that, as Bill mentioned, in my career, I actually started at these 2 facilities back in the 80s, Kingsville Dome being the first one, and ultimately, and then second is Rosita for their construction startup and operations. But they're located in South Texas, which is a well-known uranium producing district with significant upside resources. The USGS estimates that there's another potential 220 million pounds in South Texas that can be accessed for uranium recovery. And that's what we're looking at. So Rosita and Kingsville Dome both have operated as production facilities, and their remaining resources at those locations are relatively limited, but there's tremendous upside in Texas uranium belt. We have Butler Ranch, which we brought on board, which is an exploration project, as well as we acquired Vasquez, which is a project that's depleted now, and is currently in the final stages of fully being decommissioned and released. But it's an exciting time, and Texas is an exciting place to do work. It has a very well-known and regulatory environment. With our facilities licensed already, adding additional well fields is going to be a matter of an amendment and limited permitting. We're focusing on known resources as we advance these projects forward. A little bit about the 2 facilities. As Bill intimated, they have a production capacity. Right now, combined, it's about 1.6 million pounds per year. That capacity is not based on a licensed capacity, but based on simply on the drying capacity. There's 2 dryers, one at each location, and each one has about an 800,000 pound per year drying capacity. But the nice thing that was done is when these plants were upgraded, the prior operator built in additional capacity, the infrastructure to be able to add additional drying capacity without significant construction work. It's a matter of installing the dryer itself. These are modular designs, and so we can add capacity or even move capacity from Kingsville to Rosita if we need to increase capacity there. We're starting we got a limited capital campaign from our most recent financing that we're doing to basically restore Rosita to production capability. We see that as being we know it is a relatively limited capital program. We expect at most about $1 million, and probably in less than a year to get done. And the reason for that is that a lot of the work had already been done. Rosita had been fully upgraded and never quite finished because the market turned back in 2008. And so we're able to effectively just bolt on what was left to be put on, and then effectively refurbish pumps, et cetera. So it's a well-known, and we have a pretty good handle on what it's going to take. Kingsville Dome actually was upgraded in 2005 as a central processing plant. When we talk about these basically the well fields have remote ion exchange facilities, satellite facilities, similar to what one sees up in Wyoming, et cetera. And the uranium is produced at these locations, and the resin is loaded at the mine, the well fields, and then transported back to a central processing plant where the uranium is recovered. Both these plants are configured that way, and Kingsville Dome had a very successful run. They operated 3 remote ion exchange plants at Kingsville, and also supported all the production that came out of Vasquez. So it demonstrated the concept works and can be successful, and even in Texas. And as a result, Kingsville is going to take a little bit more refurbishment simply because it has more wear and tear, whereas Rosita doesn't. We see, and as a result, we have both these facilities we can leverage as market conditions demand. We also, as part of this acquisition, picked up an experienced and trained workforce that's limited in size, but not in experience, and certainly not in heart. And they provide the core organization for us to be able to build out, and as we restart these facilities, they are the ones that are actually executing on the capital campaign. So we'll do most of that in-house rather than relying on third parties. You see, South Texas, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of upside with respect to future development. We already know we have an existing well field with limited production resources at Rosita, but we also picked up a significant land package that came with us, principally around Butler Ranch. But also, we're actively acquiring properties now in South Texas to feed Rosita, and these are properties that we know have known measured resources that can be transitioned to NI 43-101 standards very quickly. And this all is a result of a recently acquired large database that we acquired from a former operator that had previously licensed and permitted some properties and basically never produced them or constructed them. So they're low-hanging fruit, and we're actively engaged on acquiring properties in those areas to be able to bring in feed to Rosita. We see that, and in addition to that, we're looking for the future as well in South Texas. We're looking at other properties, exploiting these databases for us. We don't. The beauty of all this work in the database we have, we don't have to go do greenfield exploration and locate new facilities. We can and resources. We can leverage off what we know already. As Bill mentioned, as part of the Westwater transaction that we completed at the end of 2020, we acquired a significant addition to our already large position in New Mexico. If you look at the map, the areas that are noted in green are areas that we acquired through the transaction, but everything else we actually had under our control prior to that. So we have a substantial position in New Mexico, and that map, if you look at it, to the east of the map is Albuquerque, to the west is Arizona. So you get an idea. It's a fairly large, broad section. Significant amount of productions come out of this area, but there's a whole lot left that's in the ground. I believe in the New Mexico state, or the mining, New Mexico Geological Services determined that there's over 400 million pounds of unmined mineralization just in the areas where we have interest. As Bill mentioned, there's New Mexico has some of its challenges simply because of the legacy. The New Mexico is where most of the production came out of for the United States back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And with that, most of that activity was done prior to a lot of the safety and environmental controls that are put in place that we live under these days. And so it's left a legacy of abandoned mine sites, particularly on Native American-owned properties and tribal lands, as well as created significant health issues for the local communities. And so we believe that we're going to have to, we will have to do some work in the local communities, particularly those closer to the Native American-owned lands, to bring in an ability for them to take part in the success we're showing we're going to be doing, not just by building a couple of parks, et cetera, or strictly a jobs program, but looking at for them find a way to have a sweat equity into this business. There are already similar programs. A good example is what Cameco has done up in Saskatchewan with the First Nations, and also there's some programs that or companies, joint private-public partnerships that are on the Navajo Nation that have provide good models for this. But we believe there's tremendous upside out there, and a significant portion of these properties will be able to be exploited using the in-situ recovery process, which we're using in South Texas. A little bit about some of our properties in detail. Here's our resource over. This includes both New Mexico as well as Arizona and Texas. You can see that the bulk of our resources rest in New Mexico, but we believe that the other, particularly Texas, will begin to move up on the tier on these on this report, this list, as we be able to make public results from our drilling programs. Our largest holding is our 43-101 of 43-101 resources at Crown Point, Hosta Butte. This is located on a already licensed facility that is owned and controlled by Laramide Resources. The NRC license, that's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, allows them to recover up to 3 million pounds per year. It is part of a larger complex and larger licensed facility that we will be able to, that we own a significant portion of the mineral estate there. So we see this as being probably the fastest in situ recovery of production that could come on board in New Mexico. Juan Tafoya Marquez is, as Bill mentioned, that's where we were doing some additional evaluation work. These are actually two projects. Juan Tafoya came to us through the Westwater transaction. We had control of Marquez. They're not actually two mines. They're one property that are separated, and these two mines projects are separated literally by a fence. This is a historic facility that had been, was going under development back in the 70s and 80s before the uranium industry basically started its retraction in the U.S. And we even have, the shaft is currently sunk down to 1,800 feet just above the ore body. But it's all been already been assessed for conventional mining. And, they originally had a mill built right next to the facility, or it was actually constructed. It's completely dismantled now, but it does provide the viability of production in the future. And we're currently redoing, or basically taking the 43-101 reports for these two properties, combining them, updating them, and then putting in conducting a preliminary economic assessment to evaluate the economics of the project. Still looks pretty good. Obviously, in today's current spot market, it's not going to be produced at this time. But it's the one strength it has is that it's unified, one ore body that's unified with infrastructure in place, but also it's on leased lands that are part of a Spanish land grant holding, and we see it as being a good future opportunity for us. Another property is Nose Rock, somewhere it's potentially ISR amenable. We have significant information on that, and then we're currently consolidating the land position on that. And West Largo as well, similar. Ambrosia Lake Tree Line as well. It's a combining of enCore and Westwater properties in the Ambrosia Lake District, which has significant historic uranium mining, as well as it's solution mineable as well. And this is what I like to call our secret sauce, is our database. As I mentioned, that we don't believe there's not a need to do any significant or a greenfield exploration, because everybody else has done it for us already, and these databases demonstrate that. You can see on the list that not only are there data that we've gotten from uranium mining companies that we've all known recently, but also oil and gas companies, as well as railroads and others that have historically operated in the districts where we have properties. That provides us, that data provides us a tremendous amount of information to allow us to be able to leverage that to advance properties without having to go out and spend a lot of exploration drilling to identify them. We can identify these and then firm up the resources after we've acted on that information. And this is a wrap up of our investment summary. As you know, we're focused on ISR production because of its low capital cost, and low operating costs, relatively speaking, and the fact that we have existing licenses. We already have current 43-101 resources, and we intend to add to those over the course of the next few months to a year. And with our strong team, we believe we have demonstrated history and experience in actually executing and constructing and operating. With our land position in New Mexico, we have a really strong bench strength for future projects, and we are able to leverage these 2 uranium production facilities in Texas to be able to take advantage of the next boom, which we see is just around the corner, and execute on that as well. So we believe that our strength is in our growth plan. And with that, I'll let Bill come back on, and I think Davis may have some questions.
Thank you very much, Paul and Bill. Very informative presentation. And we can now kickstart the Q&A portion of the webinar. A reminder to everybody on the line, you can insert your questions into the chat box anytime, and we will get to them as soon as we can. So already have a few questions here. Guys, with the acquisition of the Texas ISR projects and processing facilities, does your focus shift from New Mexico to Texas? And you mentioned that the USGS already believes there might be 220 million pounds of potential in Texas. What do you think has better upside or better opportunity for enCore? Which state?
Let me take the first crack at that. Clearly our focus shifted immediately to Texas from New Mexico. New Mexico, as Paul and I both have mentioned, is our long-term core strength of 5 years out on, and we view it as a 5-year proposition. If it comes in a little bit sooner, and perhaps some of them will, that's fine. But we don't have it in our short-term plan. Our short-term energy and focus are strictly on Texas. Paul, did you have any other comment on that?
No, I think you said exactly what I was going to say. So yeah.
All right.
Okay, and are your New Mexico projects, are they permitted? And can you explain if New Mexico permitting process is as streamlined as, say, Texas or Wyoming or other jurisdictions?
Well, none of our New Mexico properties are permitted by us. Now, as I mentioned during the presentation, Crown Point has a existing Nuclear Regulatory Commission license on it, as well as some state permits on it. But those are held by others, i.e. the Laramide Resources. But the regulatory process in New Mexico is also a little bit more challenging than it is in Texas, simply because it's a bifurcated process. That is that the federal government has the licensing, that is for the radioactive materials, through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then on the key part that in New Mexico, and as for in situ recovery, is the underground injection control permitting, which is controlled by the state of New Mexico. So you have 2 separate regulatory paths. There's overlap as well between the 2, and so it does create a more complicated regulatory process up there. And that's why Texas is a focus now, is because it is a relatively streamlined. It's a well-known process. And it's and the costs as well are much less to go focus on Texas immediately.
Okay, and do you think actually that New Mexico might become an agreement state, much like Wyoming has done recently, or Texas is?
I would suspect it's not likely. They were an agreement state back until 1996, when they gave the program up back to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So it's unlikely that they will go pick it up again.
Okay, thank you. Does enCore have the social license to move forward with uranium mining around the Navajo Nation territory? And what's your relationship like with this community?
I'll let Bill take that one.
Yeah, I would say, it's certainly not in place now. It's not a light switch. You don't flip it, and by extension, I'll give you some examples. In the Yukon, on a gold company that we were involved with, and some of our team members, it was a multi-year, extremely long process. You aren't coming in and, as I think Paul mentioned, building a gazebo and handing out jobs. You're really cultivating a long-term relationship, especially in the case of New Mexico, where, if done properly, we're looking at a 40 or 50 year time period of a relationship, and potentially much longer than that. So you've got to be careful the way you do it, and you don't buy trust, you earn it, and there's a big difference. One of the key programs that we would be looking at would be very much like the Tyson Majetic joint venture in Saskatchewan that Paul had mentioned as well with Cameco. And just to give you a little snapshot of the type of thing that can be done, we're in the early days with it, and obviously with COVID, we haven't been able to do much in person, although we certainly were active and at the front of providing relief supplies to the Navajo who were particularly hard hit by COVID. But the Tyson Majetic really is a blueprint, and no two will be exactly the same, but it's a very, very good example where Tyson Engineering started a joint venture with the Majetic group of First Nations, a number of them, in Saskatchewan with $1 million of seed money. And that was probably 15, 20 years ago now, certainly 15. And that's turned into a $100 million, enterprise, and it covers all facets, not just labor, but all facets of mine servicing and supply. And it's not just restricted to Cameco; it's now in the potash mines, and it's also spreading outside of Saskatchewan. And it's driven by the Aboriginal or First Nation people, and they manage it, they run it, and it's a classic case of how you can do this right. And you actually build careers, not jobs, and you build a lasting, enduring economic engine for them. And it's not a handout; it's a helping hand, if you will. And but it takes time, and so we aren't there yet, but we're dedicated to it. And here again, that's reflective of why we say it's on our 5-year out time horizon.
Okay, all part of the sustainability of the project, I would imagine. So.
Well, it is, and quite frankly, it goes beyond just an Aboriginal issue, and you're looking at it anywhere that you're doing business. If you're doing business anywhere with any community, you're the guest. You're going in, whether it's in Wyoming, you're a guest of the ranchers that have been there for generations. And if you don't treat them properly and develop the right relationship, you're going to have a bumpy road. And so you've got to, I call it the good neighbor policy. You've got to implement that wherever you are. It's just recent that the social license has become quite a buzzword in the mining industry and the ESG and all of that. But realistically, it's something that you've got to practice, or you aren't going to get there, and you've got to believe in it, or you aren't going to be very good at it. So I think on both those marks, we'll check the boxes, and it's here again far greater than just checking a box. It's actually doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, earning that trust is actually part of my next question. In South Texas, a lot of ground is tied up as being private as opposed to public or owned by the country. How easy is it to arrange surface rights in Texas, and does this really help or hurt your cause when it comes to permitting projects?
Well, it's a leasing and is basically, first of all, that most of the land is broken up into smaller tracts on private property, but there are some larger tracts, large ranches that have significant uranium resources. And it's a matter of just coming to terms. And we've been successful to this point. At least I feel we have on acquiring some of these leases, et cetera. And also the landowners are much more realistic these days. Most of them were looking at the oil and gas industry as setting their benchmarks for pricing and et cetera. And with the retraction in the oil industry, particularly on the Eagle Ford Shale down in South Texas, it has brought more realism back into the eyes of the landowners. It never is something that happens overnight. You do have to negotiate. You have to have a conversation with these folks. And we have an experienced set of land experts that have talked to, who know these landowners from past negotiations, et cetera. So there's a high level of trust with them. And so I would say that it is a trust building exercise. You've got to earn their trust. There's some landowners that have been burned by prior operators, and they don't, you got to make sure that they understand that you're going to live up to what you say you're going to do. And that's how we operate. That's my philosophy, is to minimize our impact on their lands, keep our footprint, even though we may lease, a few hundred acres, keep our impact as minimal as possible, so we don't disturb what the landowner has going on the other parts of their land. And it keeps them happy.
Okay, thank you. You've got 89 million pounds of historical resources right now in the firm. Do you plan to upgrade any of these to compliant resources? And would you consider any pre-feasibility or feasibility studies for those projects? If so, do you believe the stock will get a re-rating as the projects are being advanced?
We'd already mentioned we are doing the Juan Tafoya Marquez update, which is a PEA. Given current economics of the uranium industry, we will not. We don't have any immediate plans of advancing that through feasibility. As I say, are concentrating, almost 100% on the Texas operation, and leasing up tracts with known mineralization, bringing our existing historical resources there up to standards. So there will be, and I think there will be, a re-rating on all of these things. And the one Tafoya Marquez project in New Mexico is on Spanish land grant, as opposed to it's further east in the state. So it's certainly going to be a positive for us. I don't think it in itself is going to be dramatic, but I think as things unfold over the course of the year in Texas, I think that'll be quite dramatic.
And I'll add that sometimes by the time we get done with the fees in Texas, and particularly the way most in situ ISR operators work, I expect by the time we get working on a feasibility study, we may already be installing well fields. And so that so the feasibility study would probably effectively be something that's almost as an as-built.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and let's assume uranium price is not an issue today. What projects can you get into production fairly quickly? What would be a priority for you?
Well, obviously our South Texas properties would be a priority because they're licensed, right? So the permitting and licensing aspect is very well addressed, and we see that as advancing quickly. And and with that, we have some properties that like I mentioned, we're already trying to advance as part of through an acquisition program that will allow us to bring Rosita up to full capacity, and also extend its life, and possibly provide enough resources to support Kingsville as well.
Okay. You already have a fairly large leadership team. Are you completely staffed to move the projects forward towards production, or would you have to find more workers? And, are there experienced ISR workers available in South Texas? And
we've actually been, just so you understand, I'm trying to be judicious with our timing on these things, but particularly in South Texas, since I've worked there for a significant part of my career, I've developed relationships and networking with a lot of people down there. We're just next week we have a 35-year experienced geologist joining the team that's spent most of his career in South Texas on doing uranium roll front and wellfield design, starting with us next week. We'll be adding fortunately, with the Westwater acquisition, we did get some engineering and technical staff with it, limited as it is, but we will be adding people as the timing allows us to come forward. And then on the workforce, there are local workers nearby that are looking to come back to work. We have an HR person who's told us that there's people who are calling her every day who've worked at these sites before. So we've got it's very promising that we'll be able to staff up, but again, I just don't want to get ahead of where the market is and where we need to be.
Okay, fair enough. So would you guys consider looking at non-ISR projects, considering there are quite a few of them in the throughout the four corner states or elsewhere. Maybe look at these projects from an ISR angle, or just the fact that these projects might just be unloved at this point, and there's a value proposition picking them up now and moving them to somewhere else down the road, flipping them essentially.
Yeah, it's one of the things we are doing in New Mexico is a lot of these projects really haven't been looked at for ISR. Most of the ones we have there, certainly in terms of the vast majority of the pounds, are ISRable. But some of the others, such as Juan Tafoya Marquez, portions of that may be ISRable. And so these are things that we'll be in the course of reevaluating them, looking at. But conventional is not our focus. Our team is set up for ISR. That's where we do have some experience in conventional. Paul may want to address that, but our focus and the team has been built for ISR.
Okay.
Sorry, Dave. Go ahead.
Well, I was just sort of, with this conventional not being your focus, it sort of leads into another question here. Would you consider collaborating with Energy Fuels for rare earths as additional revenue? But it sounds A, uranium is your focus, B, conventional is not your focus, right? So,
well, who knows what the future holds with respect to future relationships. Most of our properties that we have, with the exception of possibly some in Arizona, have limited access to rare earths and other minerals. There's some other critical minerals in there. We've got some vanadium on some of the properties that are conventionally mined, and then molybdenum is another one that is predominant in some of the South Texas deposits, along with uranium. But in reality, the larger focus is that, and it goes back to our conventional properties. It depends on where things are when we're ready to look at executing them. Right now, there's one operating uranium mill in the U.S. and that's owned by Energy Fuels. That creates opportunities, but it depends on their business strategy at that time. And as a result, our focus, we see in situ recovery as being the ability for us to act independently without relying on others to execute. And but we're not ruling out our conventional properties for the future. We're just we know our knitting right now is focused on ISR.
Okay. We have seen a lot of physical uranium purchases lately by uranium companies in particular, including a small 300,000 pound purchase by enCore. What's your rationale for buying and holding uranium, and do you plan to do this from an investment or speculative angle?
You want to take that, Bill?
Sure. I think I mentioned in the beginning, we aren't speculators on price. We do think it's a good entry point, but our main motivation in taking down the uranium was somewhat coincidental with the rush into uranium by a number of other entries, each one of which has a slightly different take on why they're doing it. Ours was calculated in terms of its size, and also in the fact that the nuclear industry is starting to float proposals for contracts, and in evaluating those, we certainly want to look at some of those, but we also don't want to be in the process of, commissioning a new well field and having some hiccup delay us by, a month or two or three on our delivery schedule. So by having that reserve, it really is an insurance policy and possible interruptions or unforeseen hiccups in terms of a delivery schedule on contracts. And as such, I don't think, we obviously review things and it's not a static picture, but there's no intention on building a massive uranium resource for us. That's the primary function for it in our case.
Okay, so speaking of delivery schedules, the next question is, what's the status of the U.S. Strategic Uranium Reserve Program, and will enCore be in a position to participate in that?
Well, it's currently, going through what they call the evaluation process with the Department of Energy. So basically, DOE is doing a NEPA analysis. That's the National Environmental Protection Act. Any federal action has to go through that process. And they're also going to be issuing a request for information on how they want and get information on how they could structure the uranium purchasing program. The funding is there for $75 million, which is for fiscal year 2021. and so the expectation is at some point that they will be purchasing within, by the end of the fiscal year, at least have commit to purchases before the end of the fiscal year. Currently, there's an appropriations and budget process going on right now. Our expectation is DOE is going to ask for the $150 million for next year, and based on the bipartisan support we saw come out of the appropriations process, as well as some of the other actions by by Congress and the statements coming out of the Biden administration, we expect that it'll continue to be funded and hopefully at the full amount. And from enCore's perspective, if we're given an opportunity to participate in it, we're not going to turn it down. We will, if we're in a position where we can actually participate in that buying program, we certainly will. We will consider that at the point that opportunity arises.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody really know what they're going to be offering the companies, or what companies are going to be offering? I think the point is to get uranium production started or supported in the U.S. Can they do that by spreading around the purchases to 4 or 5 or 6 different companies?
I would say that there's a limited value in them being able to do that. They're going to have to pick. What they're going to do is they've said they're going to do a competitive process. And, in the past, the DOE has a history of doing uranium purchases from 1964 all the way to 1982. And and it also provides a good template for DOE right now. And effectively, they were doing competitive biddings back in 1982, as recently as then. And basically, the competition is they would let out a contract for a fixed price, and basically you competed to see who could actually deliver into that contract at that price. And it's not necessarily on a first come first serve basis. It's based on there's a whole lot of factors that go into that calculation, and it's public information. And my expectation is that we'll come up with, even though they're going through this RFI process, we'll come up with something similar to that. But it'll be in blocks big enough to where it may be a few 100,000 pounds here, a few 100,000 pounds there on a purchase request or proposal, but it'll be something they have to deliver into. And the idea is to restart mining so we can sustain the existing infrastructure and workforce. So I expect that we'll know more, but not everybody will be able to participate in it.
Okay, and I guess a question more, a broader question, but along the same lines. Sort of, what's your take on the Biden clean energy plan and the associated infrastructure spending plan? What do you see as the future for the U.S. nuclear industry?
Bill, you want to start and I'll finish?
Sure. I think, as you pointed out, it's really, if you're going to deal with baseload windmills and solar panels, don't cut it. And you've got a very, and as Texas has demonstrated pretty convincingly this winter. So really there is no alternative for green energy other than an increase in nuclear. And, we think that, we'll see good support from the administration. To the degree, I think that more than the support, I think the timing and the swiftness of their movement may be the issue. They're a bit more bureaucratic than the previous administration, and things will take longer, I believe, and be reviewed more. I don't know about more thoroughly, but the review process is likely to take a bit longer with this administration. But I think the support and the underlying position and being pro-nuclear here again is the key. And I see it, it's not going to be a short-term event. I think, the climate concerns, the green energy concerns are not a passing fancy. It's something to be here for, a while. And I think that coupled with the global growth and the global concerns of the very same subject are going to see the nuclear industry and really the most prolonged cycle that we've seen for the private industry sector probably ever. And we're just on the cusp of that. So, we certainly welcome their support and think it'll be a lasting thing. And quite frankly, I don't think it's going to be subject to political change. How it's done and timelines certainly might be affected by political change. But even if we swing back, the pendulum swings back to the other side here, I think there's going to have to be a more basic and strong commitment to nuclear going forward than we've seen, since pre-3 Mile Island back in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add is that, the Biden administration has stated very clearly that in order for them to execute on their clean energy plans, they need to keep the existing nuclear fleet going. And it'll be a test. From my perspective, in my opinion, I think it'll be a test to see how they respond to the announced closures of the Byron and Dresden nuclear power plants that are scheduled to close this year by Exelon, and those are vital to meet their objectives and also to live up to their commitments. We know that the state of Illinois is acting, but it would be good to have a signal from the federal government on this. I think Secretary Granholm has weighed in somewhat on this, but I think she really needs some strong policy leadership. But the bottom line is that I think that even if you go to the people that are the most progressive on the clean energy side of it, there's no denying that nuclear has to be part of it in order for them to achieve their goal. Right now, it contributes 55% of the clean energy in the United States. And so you can't get to your endpoints, what is it, a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 without either continuing nuclear power as it is or increasing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you and I are preaching to the same choir here in this call, but really when it comes down to it, were you surprised the Biden administration is really speaking about nuclear in the same vein as hydro?
I'm not surprised. I think that's a realistic position for them. And the thing is that the one thing we won't see is more hydro plants. In fact, they're actually tearing some down right now.
Then hydro is not, all things in all instances. Washington State was almost exclusively hydro for a long time, and a few years of drought really put it's the same as the wind not blowing for windmills.
Fair enough. Okay. I guess this is probably going to lead into a supply-demand question here. Paul, somebody noticed you were with Cameco and Energy Fuels. Are you concerned about Cigar Lake Mine closing again, and maybe the ramifications of that? I
can't get inside what the management of Cameco is thinking. I think they've been pretty transparent on their plans with Cigar Lake. I would expect they would not close it down again unless the government forced them to close it down with respect to COVID. But they've come up with their corrective actions going forward. Closing that mine down and putting it on standby is expensive, and it costs a lot of money. And and that uranium they're producing, they've already got committed to contracts. And I know there was some dismay about the fact, well, maybe that means they'll buy less on the spot market. It seems like other people are making sure that doesn't matter. But the main thing is that the cost of purchasing is probably at or above where their cost of production is. So to get it online as fast as they can, I think was probably a prudent move on their part. And I don't expect that they'll look to shut it down again. They need to keep it going. It's too expensive for it not to operate.
Right. Well, we still don't have guidance or a startup date yet from Cameco. They're still working on that. So, okay, just sort of a final question here. Group 11, it's a company that is looking at using ISR mining for copper or gold projects in the U.S. Can you provide an update on Group 11 Technologies, of which I believe enCore has a partial ownership in?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that. We've got a 40% interest. It's not to be funded anymore by the current shareholders. It'll remain private as long as it's in the research and development phase. Funding to come from private, primarily U.S. sources, primarily non-mining sources. It's really a high-tech company. It's not really a mining company. It just happens to be related to metals. They did recently announce that they've picked up their first agreement with GFG Gold in terms of the Rattlesnake project in Wyoming. And obviously being in Wyoming was a key factor there, in that the regulators are quite familiar with ISL. And in fact, some of the principals in the company are known individually to them. And, when we were looking at that at Group 11, it was clearly a motivating factor, in that who knows how long it would take to educate and work with regulators that aren't familiar with ISL, even if they're in pro mining and jurisdiction. So that was key. Also key is the size of the project, the number of different rock types that the gold occurs in, the number of different forms that the gold occurs in. It really is an ideal research laboratory for Group 11 to move forward with a number of leach tests and permeability induction studies and that sort of thing. So, it really is a wild card. It's basically for enCore, it's a call option. We don't intend to put any additional funding in, but we think it's much like the in situ uranium was. Before it was done, everyone said it couldn't be done, and the only way you can make sure you don't win the lottery is don't buy a ticket. So we're optimistic, but realize that it's going to be 3 to 4 years probably before you really get any meaningful breakthrough. And but if it does, it could revolutionize the mining industry. And a side benefit to enCore, of course, is the look and study of using that lixiviant for uranium deposits that are trend ore or primary ore that previously have not been leachable. And there's quite a bit of enthusiasm on that front as well. So, that's what long-term, stay tuned, could be a game changer. But, we're going to go about our daily business here at enCore and concentrate on the Texas ISL or ISR assets and go that route.
Perfect. Well, guys, we're up on the top of the hour. So, I'd like to thank you, Paul, and you, Bill, from enCore. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in here. Just a reminder again, please register for our upcoming uranium conference on Thursday, May 13th. Red Cloud Securities will be back tomorrow when Kobe Kushner sits down with Empress Royalty. That's April 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So, everybody, have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
everyone.